In a previous video, we told you what happened to Draupadi in the Kuru court, how she was staked in a dice game by her own husband, how Dushasana dragged her by the hair into the assembly, how the men of the Kuru dynasty, warriors, elders, kings, sat in silence while she was humiliated, how she asked one question that nobody answered. Who had the right to stake her? Today we tell you what happened next. Not the war, not the battle, not the 18 days of Kurukshetra. The curse. Draupadi stood in that assembly with her hair unbound, hair that would remain unbound, she swore, until she could wash it in Dushasana's blood. And she said something that the Mahabharata records with extraordinary precision and that the popular retellings almost always skip past. She cursed the Kuru dynasty, every major death at Kurukshetra, Bhishma, Drona, Karna, Duryodhana, all 100 sons of Dhritarashtra, traces back to what she said in that room. Not to Krishna's strategy, not to the Pandavas' army, not to fate, to her. The Sabab Parva of the Mahabharata, the book that records the dice game and the disrobing, records Draupadi's words in the assembly with specific detail that most retellings compress into a simple vow of revenge. She did not simply vow that her hair would remain unbound until she could wash it in Dushasana's blood. She addressed the entire assembly. She said, "The Kauravas will not die on a normal battlefield. They will die for what happened in this room today." She addressed Dhritarashtra, the blind king who sat at the head of the assembly, and said nothing, and told him what his silence had purchased. She addressed the elders, Bhishma, Drona, Kripa, men who had the authority to stop what was happening and chose not to use it. She told them, "You watched. You were silent. You will answer for your silence." The Mahabharata calls what happened in that room a violation of Dharma so complete that it set in motion consequences that could not be stopped, not by divine intervention, not by repentance, not by the years that followed. Draupadi's grief in that assembly was the force that the war ran on. We told you about Bhishma in a previous video, but let us look at the Sabha Parva, the dice game, specifically. Bhishma was not ignorant of the law. He was the most learned jurist in the Kuru dynasty. He knew the answer. He chose the technical complexity over the moral clarity. He did not stand up. He offered instead a technical legal argument. He said he could not answer Draupadi's question, who had the right to stake her, because the question of whether a man who has staked himself can stake his wife is too complex for him to resolve definitively. Bhishma was the most respected figure in the Kuru assembly. He had the authority of decades of impeccable dharma behind him. When he spoke, the assembly listened. If he had stood up when Draupadi was dragged into that room and said, "This ends now," it would have ended. Draupadi's curse landed on him specifically. On the 10th day of Kurukshetra, Bhishma fell, pierced by Arjuna's arrows, his fall enabled by Shikandi's presence, which Bhishma refused to fight because Shikandi had been born Amba, The woman Bhishma had destroyed in a previous life was the reason he could not defend himself. But the deeper reckoning was Draupadi's. He watched. He was silent. He answered for his silence. Drona was the greatest teacher of his age. He had trained every warrior on both sides of the war. He sat in the Kuru assembly as Draupadi was humiliated. He said nothing. The man who had trained Arjuna, who had trained Karna, who had trained Duryodhana, who had spent his life teaching the ethics and conduct of the warrior, sat in silence while his student's wife was subjected to the worst violation possible in the assembly. Not because he approved, because he was afraid of consequences to himself, because his position depended on Duryodhana's patronage, because speaking would have cost him something. Draupadi did not forget this. Drona's death at Kurukshetra was one of the most deliberate in the entire war. He was killed through the lie about Ashwathama, the deception that Yudhishthira participated in, that Krishna engineered, that used a false announcement of his son's death to break his will to fight. The teacher who taught others how to fight was killed while he was not fighting, while his weapons were down, while he was in grief over a lie about his son. The Mahabharata makes the connection explicitly. Drona's death was considered a violation of the rules of war. It was commented on as such. It was also exactly proportional to what Drona had done in the assembly. He had violated the rules of his own conduct. He had sat in silence during the violation of a woman he had the power to protect. If Bhishma and Drona were guilty of silence, Karna was guilty of the opposite. Karna spoke. He called Draupadi a whore. He said, in the assembly, in public, that a woman who has 5 husbands is a woman of no virtue. He told Dushasana to take her clothes. This was the man who knew what it meant to be stripped of dignity. Karna had spent his entire life being told he was not worthy, that his birth disqualified him, that whatever he achieved could be taken away because of who his mother was and who his father was unknown to be. And in the moment of Draupadi's humiliation, he used that same weapon against her. Draupadi's curse on Karna was personal in a way it was not for the others. He had not merely watched. He had participated. He had encouraged it. At Kurukshetra, Karna died while his chariot wheel was stuck in the mud. He was unarmed. He called out to Arjuna to observe the warrior's code and wait for him to free his wheel. Arjuna hesitated. Krishna told him to fire. He died without a weapon, having been stripped of the one protection that his conduct should have guaranteed. The warrior's code that said you do not kill an unarmed man. He was stripped of protection in the moment of his death, as he had stripped Draupadi of protection in the moment of hers. Duryodhana had ordered it. He had arranged the dice game. He had told Dushasana to drag Draupadi by the hair. He had patted his thigh and told her to come sit on it. He had watched everything with visible satisfaction. Draupadi's response to Duryodhana was specific and spoken directly. She said, "The man who patted his thigh in my presence, that thigh will be broken." Bhima echoed this vow. He swore to break Duryodhana's thigh with his own hands. At Kurukshetra, after 18 days of war, when only the principals remained, Bhima and Duryodhana fought their final battle with maces. Duryodhana was the superior mace fighter. He was winning. Krishna signaled Bhima, pointed to his own thigh. Bhima struck below the belt, breaking Duryodhana's thigh. It was against the rules of mace combat. Balarama was furious. He called it a violation. Duryodhana's thigh was broken exactly as Draupadi had specified that it would be. All 100 sons of Dhritarashtra died at Kurukshetra, every single one. Dushasana, the one who had actually dragged her into the assembly, was killed by Bhima, who tore open his chest and drank his blood. Exactly as Draupadi had sworn she would wash her hair in his blood. She washed her hair. She bound it again. What the popular retellings of the Mahabharata present as the inevitable machinery of Dharma, the war that had to happen, the deaths that were fated, the divine plan that Krishna was executing, is also, read carefully, the precise fulfillment of a woman's curse. Every specific death at Kurukshetra corresponds to a specific failure of conduct in the Kuru assembly on the day of the dice game. Bhishma died because he chose technical argument over moral clarity. Drona died while unarmed, having sat silent while a woman was disrobed. Karna died without a weapon, having told a man to disrobe a woman. Duryodhana's thigh was broken exactly as she specified. Dushasana's blood washed her hair. This is not coincidence. The Mahabharata does not work in coincidence. The scholar Alf Hiltebeitel, whose work on the Mahabharata structure remains foundational, documented how Draupadi's role in the epic is not that of a victim who is avenged. She is the axis around which the war's moral logic turns. The Sabha-parva, her humiliation, is not a cause of the war in the way that a trigger causes an explosion. It is the seed from which the war grew with exact and terrible precision. The war did not avenge Draupadi. It completed her curse. The story of Draupadi's curse has been present in the Mahabharata for 5,000 years. It is in the text. It is not hidden. But the popular retellings consistently place it in the background, framing the war as the Pandavas story, Krishna's story, Dharma's story. What the text actually shows is that the war's moral engine was a woman who stood in an assembly where every man with power chose silence or participation over justice, and who told them in that moment what their choice had purchased. There is a reason this resonates so deeply right now. We live in a world full of assemblies where people with power choose silence, where technical complexity is offered instead of moral clarity, where the rules of conduct are suspended when it is convenient and invoked when it serves the powerful, where the person being harmed asks a direct question, "Who had the right to do this?" and receives either argument or silence. The Mahabharata's answer to what happens in such assemblies is specific and patient. The war comes. Not immediately, not loudly, not all at once. 13 years later, on a battlefield, the reckoning arrives in the exact form that the wronged person specified. She stood in that assembly. She said what would happen, and then she waited, and the Mahabharata kept its word. Every wall holds a story. Some walls were built by the woman they forgot to silence completely.